his election to the Senate, Senator Wiener served as a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing the district previously represented by Harvey Milk. He also chaired the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. Before taking public office, Senator Wiener practiced law for 15 years, including nearly a decade as deputy city attorney in the San Francisco City Attorney's Office. He also served in a number of community leadership roles, including co-chair of the San Francisco LGBT Community Center and on the National Board of Directors of the Human Rights Campaign. Senator Wiener has lived in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 1997, and he received degrees from Duke University and Harvard Law School and was a Fulbright Scholar in Santiago, Chile. Nice to have you, Senator.
Great. Thank you, Adam. Thank you all for having me. And excuse me, sorry for my voice. Thank you for being part of the Democratic Party and for being running a Democratic club. I came up through the Democratic clubs, and in fact, I co-chaired one, the Alice B. Toklas LGBT Democratic Club back in 2005, 2006, I think. So I'm a big believer in Democratic clubs. It's really the heart of the grassroots of our party. So thank you for what you do. Thank you also for sending Dave Min to the Senate. I'm a huge fan of Dave. He's a fantastic colleague, just a really all-around great guy, really smart, and a great addition to the Senate. So thank you for helping get him up to Sacramento. So I think I was asked to speak about housing tonight. Even though it's not the only issue I focus on, I do a lot of work around criminal justice reform and food access and poverty and clean energy and LGBTQ civil rights and other issues. Housing, mental health is another big focus for me, and addiction. But housing is at the intersection of everything. If you think about what is essential to human existence, other than like air and water and food and childbirth, housing is probably somewhere close to being after those pillars of life. When you think of the other challenges that we have in California around homelessness, around poverty, around mental health, around climate, around wildfires, so many of those challenges intersect with housing. Our housing crisis and the high cost of housing because of a massive shortage pushes people into poverty who might not otherwise be in poverty because they're spending so much of their paycheck for housing. It pushes people into homelessness. And there, I think, is a common notion that everyone who's homeless must have a mental health issue or be using drugs. And that's not true. That many homeless people are simply people who cannot afford housing, many of whom were housed, and they're now living in a car or in a shelter or couch surfing or whatnot because they simply cannot afford housing, and they don't want to leave their community. They don't want to just move somewhere else. They want to stay in their community. Housing intersects with climate, because when we don't build enough housing in our coastal areas, whether it's Orange County or LA or San Francisco or Marin County, we push people further and further away from job centers into very long commutes, which increases carbon emissions. It also means that since 1990, almost half of the new housing that we've built in California has been built in wildfire zones, and we know increasingly that is not sustainable, and we need to reduce development pressure in wildfire zones, but of course that has to be accompanied by increasing housing production somewhere else. So in so many ways, housing intersects with almost everything, and when you look at like where we are in California now, the estimates, there are debates about what our housing shortage is. Some people say it's 3.5 million. Some people say it's 2.5 million. Some people say it's 1.5 or 2 million. Whatever, pick any of those numbers. It's huge. And so we have dug ourselves into a hole over the last really 50 years because we used to do it the old-fashioned way in California, which is the way we've done it for all of human existence. As your population grows, as more people move to an area, you build homes for them. You just match the housing production to what your population needs are, and you find ways to do that. And we used to do that in California. Back in the late 50s into the 60s, California, a state of about 15 million people, was building between 250,000 and 330,000 homes a year. Fast forward, we are now building around 100,000 homes a year, so about a 2/3 decrease for a state of 40 million people. And despite the slowing down of California's growth, we still grew. In this census, we still grew by about 3 million people, or 2.5 million people, about a 6 or 7% growth rate. If you look at the map of the US, we did not grow as fast as like a Texas or a Florida. We're still one of the states that's actually growing, not like we were 50 years ago, but we are still growing. And yet our housing production has absolutely collapsed. We're at about 100,000 now. A few years back, it was down to like 80,000. We got it up to maybe like 110. And now for the last 2 years, our housing production has gone down again. Pre-COVID, in 2019, we dropped, and then in 2020, we dropped again. So we're told that we need to be building consistently about 180,000 or so units a year to really start catching up. And we're building like barely half of that amount. So how did we get there? How did we get to the point where California, of the 50 states, ranks 49 out of 50 in homes per capita? So if you just take for every state the number of people and as a ratio with the number of housing units, homes in that state, put aside growth, put aside everything else, is number of people versus number of homes for them to live in, we rank 49 out of 50 in terms of that ratio. So there are some people out there who don't want to see more housing built. They don't want to see their communities change at all. Don't want to really make room for the people who are frankly already here, let alone new people, who say we don't have a housing shortage. It's not a housing shortage. Any way you look at it, right? Homes versus people, growth versus housing production, et cetera, et cetera. Any way you look at it, we have a very, very large shortage, and the shortage is getting worse. So how did we get here? Like I said, we used to do it the old-fashioned way and just build enough housing. And then really starting in the 70s and accelerating into the 80s, we decided that housing was no longer a priority. And so California, both at the state level and the local level, started erecting barrier after barrier to building housing. One of those barriers, and this sort of the foundational barrier, is restrictive zoning, where California and San Francisco did it, LA did it, cities all across the state did it, decided that the only kind of housing that would be legal to be built overwhelmingly would be a single family home. And sometimes in these fights we have about single family home zoning, sometimes it's portrayed as you either like single family homes or you don't. I grew up in a single family home. Single family homes are great. Single family homes are always going to be a critical part of our housing supply and our housing policy in California. But it used to be in California, we built a lot of single family homes and we built a lot of apartments too. And they were mixed together. And you can go all over the state and see neighborhoods where it looks like it's pretty much a single family home neighborhood, and there was a 12 or 16 unit apartment building there that was built in 1940. We see it in a lot of our single family zoned neighborhoods in San Francisco. There are just these random apartment buildings that are there because they were built before we downzoned. Same with LA. And so we methodically banned apartment buildings by saying the only kind of housing that you can build is a single family home, even though there might be a subway stop or nearby, even though it's really close to jobs. We're only going to allow one unit of housing per parcel. Well, you can see that creates a math issue when you limit housing in that way. Not 2 or 3 units, 1 unit per parcel. Not in some areas, but in a large majority of areas. In like 70% of LA, almost half of San Francisco, about 80% of San Jose, and in many suburban communities, it could be pushing 100%. And so that started us with that down zoning, right? It wasn't naturally that way. We made conscious decisions to eliminate zoning for multi-unit, even small multi-unit, methodically, to the point where about 70+% of the residentially zoned land in California is zoned for only single family homes. So that immediately started, and in fact, in San Francisco, if you look at the news coverage and the debates from the late 70s and early 80s when San Francisco downzoned, there was actually, in the planning department analysis, this is like in the late 70s, so long ago, it said that this downzoning will result in housing getting more expensive, and it will result in working class people not being able to live in San Francisco anymore and having to live hours away and commute if they work in the city. That was what they said in the 70s before we did it. And lo and behold, that is exactly what happened. Where in places like San Francisco or Laguna Beach, good luck if you are like a young family trying to start out and wanting a home, or or working class person wanting to raise a family. It used to be in my neighborhood in the Castro. I met when I was running for the Board of Supervisors. I met this wonderful couple. They were 90. They'd been together for 60 years. They lived in a rent-controlled apartment on Noe Street in the heart of the Castro. And it was fast. They had seen everything for 60 years in my neighborhood. And they said on their block of Noe Street back in the 1950s, there were 50 children being raised on that block. Back then in 2010, there was 0. And that's not just happenstance, because we pushed young families out. And then in addition to zoning, what we did was say, even if you're building to the zoning, we're going to make it take a really long time for you to build anything. So even if the zoning, you're doing everything that a city has said in terms of zoning and height and setbacks and design and everything else, we're going to make the permit discretionary. You're going to have to go through what might be a multi-year process, maybe 3, 4, 5, 10 years to get a project approved. We may only approve half of what it's zoned for. We know we said you can build 20, but we're only going to allow you to build 8. And then the state enacted CEQA 50 years ago, which was a very limited law to say if you're doing something like building a highway or a dam or something, you have to evaluate the environmental impacts. Through court decision, it was applied to everything. And so even a small infill project had to go through CEQA under state law, which could then be appealed and sued and everything else. So we downzoned, and then we said, even for building into the zoning, we're going to make it take a really, really long time. And lo and behold, housing got really expensive, and we developed this massive shortage. There are other reasons as well. Prop 13, and I, like many of us, I own my condo. I'm a beneficiary of Prop 13. Not as much a beneficiary as some of my neighbors, but benefit from it. But one of the real downsides of Prop 13 was, for cities, commercial development is much more lucrative than residential development, because you might get sales tax from it, you might get hotel tax, you might get business tax, you might get parking tax, whereas from residential, all you get is capped property taxes. And so cities that are struggling financially have an incentive to favor commercial over residential. We also have a construction worker shortage, due in part to bad immigration policies and some other problem policies. So that's what we got where we are. So what are we doing in the legislature? One of the, I look at it as a sort of an overdue and awkward and sometimes painful readjustment of how we do housing policy in California. For many years, we viewed housing policy as purely local. So local control, cities decide. I'm the former president of my neighborhood association, a former local elected official, and I agree that in many, many cases, local control is far superior to having the state make the decision. And there were many times when I was in local office where the state would do something and I'd be like, get off my porch, let us just do this locally, we can handle it. And I think there is a lot of local control that should exist with housing. But we have a system of extreme local control, or we had until about 5 years ago, extreme local control for housing. And when you look at something that's as important as housing, public education, if I were to say, let's have pure local control in public education, let's let school districts decide how many days you educate kids, what subjects you teach, whether teachers are credentialed, you'd probably tell me go away. Like we should have at least basic standards for public education, and then school districts operate within those standards because it's a statewide concern that affects the entire state's future. Housing is the same way. Housing is a statewide concern that affects our economy, our environment, our diversity. And so the work we've been doing is not to eliminate local control. And I sometimes get accused of that. In fact, I do a lot of legislation that gives cities more local control on different kinds of issues, because I'm a believer that cities should be able to make a lot of decisions. But on housing, we're trying to have a little bit more of a balance where the state sets some baseline standards and cities operate within those standards. So for example, with approving housing, if a city has said, this parcel is zoned for 10 units and it's 30 feet height and the setbacks are 8 feet, and et cetera, and the design standards are in this booklet here, this is the design standard. And if a developer comes forward and says, I want to build the units that you zone for at the height you zone for, with the setbacks you zone for, with the design standards in your design manual, state law should provide, and I think increasingly does provide, the city has to just give that permit. You can't put them through a process and say, we zone for 8, but we're going to give you 6. We said that these are the design standards, but we want to add 5 new design standards. We said 30 feet, we're only going to give you 25 feet. So we've enacted various laws, the Housing Accountability Act, SB 35, a streamlining law, to say that you have to just approve it. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game. And I think we're seeing more streamlining laws happening in the legislature this year. And I think we're going to have more and more of a model in California where you have the rules that are set ahead of time, mostly local and some state. And then if you check all the boxes, you get to build the project and you get an over-the-counter permit. And then in terms of zoning, so, you know, I had, you know, SB 50, the bill that, you know, was it was a big bill, was a lot in there, and the bill didn't pass. We came close to getting out of the Senate. It did not pass, but it really, I think, helped trigger a conversation that is having a lot of benefits, not just at the state level, but locally. Because I want to say a lot of times local elected officials get broad brush as being all NIMBY and anti-housing. I know a ton of city council members up and down the state, and I don't think that that is true for many city council members. I think so many city council members run for office, you get paid little or nothing, you devote a lot of time, people yell at you in the grocery store, you give up a lot of your life, and you know, people overwhelmingly are doing it because you want to serve your community, you want to do right by your community. And a lot of city council members are very pro-housing. They deeply understand the need for more housing. And sometimes because of state constraints or local political constraints, we're sort of forcing them to walk a plank every week. Say, we want you to approve more housing, but you know, you're going to get, you know, have political headaches if you do. So we're trying to just create a system so that to relieve, frankly, some pressure on city council members. So in terms of, you know, zoning, my view is that we should have some standards that, you know, like in San Francisco, if you've ever been to West Portal or Forest Hill, these are two great neighborhoods in Western San Francisco. They have subway stops, like full underground subway stations. It's a straight shot to downtown, super fast train ride downtown, zoned for only single family homes. You cannot build even a small apartment there. West Portal Avenue, which is right by that subway stop, major thoroughfare, 2-story height limit. And so that, you know, I think we need to take a look at the zoning near transit, near where the jobs are, and have that conversation, you know, about where you put multi-unit so that more people can live near transit, more people can live near jobs, people can have shorter commutes. And I think a lot of cities are wanting to do that. We make it really hard because of CEQA, and that's why I have legislation pending this year, Senate Bill 10, which is a purely voluntary tool for cities. See, I'm doing housing legislation to give a purely voluntary tool to cities that they can ignore if they want to. But what it does is that if a city wants to use it, a city can zone areas as long as it's an infill area and not sprawl for up to 10-unit buildings without having to go through CEQA and get sued under CEQA. So if they want to zone an area for fourplex, they want to do a 6-unit or 2-unit or 8-unit, whatever it is they want, as long as it's not more than 10, they can do it in a fast and efficient way. They can ignore it, but it's giving them a powerful new tool to be able to do that rezoning. And then there is legislation, which you're probably aware of, by our Senate leader, Senator Atkins from San Diego, SB 9, to have statewide duplex zoning. So we have some rezoning laws or bills pending this year. We also have several bills, and 2 bills, one in each house, to facilitate the conversion of underperforming commercial land to residential or mixed use. There are strip malls that are underperforming, or areas that are zoned commercial and nothing's ever been built there. And sometimes cities may want to convert those to residential or mixed use. It's very hard to do that now. These bills will facilitate that conversion. And so we also have been strengthening our ADU laws. And so there are a number of things that we've been doing. And then finally, I just want to say that the state, we're trying to get back into the business of supporting cities to fund affordable housing. The state took redevelopment away 10 years ago. It was a bad move. We should have fixed redevelopment to end the abuses and not eliminated it. We need to give cities more tools and more funding, and we've been allocating a lot more state funding for affordable housing. That's what I know, and happy to answer any questions. And again, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Senator. So I guess we'll start with kind of a tough question for you.
Yeah.
So it's rather obvious that the impact of SB 9 on single-family neighborhoods will be substantial, especially if cities continue to allow ADUs and JADUs on each subdivided lot. SB 9 contains provisions to protect historic resources, which is very welcome, but the entire city of Laguna Beach, including its built environment, has been recognized by the National Park Service as a historic American landscape, the only one in Orange County. How can that be protected?
So one thing to be clear that, and I think the question recognized this, so SB 9 that allows duplexes, but it does not require a city to allow ADUs on top of those duplexes. So if you choose to do, if you have a lot and you do a duplex under SB 9, unless the city affirmatively says it's okay, you can't then automatically under state law put a ADU and a junior ADU on that lot. You have to pick either your ADU or you do the full duplex. The bill also does not override local height limits, and it does not override local design standards, and it has demolition restrictions because we're not looking to demolish a neighborhood and rebuild it. So I think a lot of times with these housing bills, and I say this as someone who when I was on the Board of Supervisors, I legislated the first new statutory historic district in San Francisco in like 20 years. So, but that historic district had a mix of buildings in it. And so you can have different buildings that are about the same size. One is a single family homes, one's a duplex, they have similar design. They don't look all that different. But the thing about these changes in housing policies, they don't happen overnight. They're very gradual over time. And I think people on the more YIMBY side of things get frustrated because they want things to change overnight. People who are maybe more averse to sudden change are concerned, that think that it's going to they're going to sprout from the ground the day after the bill is signed into law. It takes a long time and it's very, very gradual. You have to have an available parcel. You have to have someone who wants to build on it. And so I think in terms of, the beauty of Laguna Beach, and we have various incredibly beautiful communities in California that with very, very historic attributes. I just don't see that dramatically changing. I think the change is gradual and it's a little bit around the edges. I think sometimes I understand when people see a bill that could potentially do X, people immediately jump to, this is going to be, oh my God, this radical change overnight. It's not. Some people want radical change overnight and then they get frustrated. It doesn't happen. So I don't think it's going to be an issue. I think Laguna Beach will continue to be a beautiful, amazing, historic place.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is kind of gets to the heart of a lot of these issues. We're dealing with the ADU ordinance in Laguna Beach. We're trying to pass it. And even though we have incentives for affordable units, not all the ADUs are going to be affordable. A large percentage of them will be market rate housing. So can you make the case for why ADUs, even if they're market rate housing, can still promote affordability?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me talk about market rate housing. I think market rate housing gets disparaged a lot. It's called like luxury housing. There is such a thing as luxury housing. We all see in different communities, you know, building with like all the amenities and it's super fancy. But a lot of new housing that gets built, whether it's an ADU or a new, you know, multi-unit building, it's not luxury at all. It's just new, and it's expensive because there's a shortage of it. And the reality is that there are. I'm willing to bet. Why don't you tell me, because you know the Laguna Beach market better. If there is like a small, dilapidated single-family home in Laguna Beach, how much would I have to pay for it if I wanted to buy it? Just small, dilapidated.
Probably like $2 million.
Yeah. So that's not a luxury home, right? But that's a really, really expensive home because of the profound shortage that we have. So market rate housing, I'm going to bet that I live in market rate housing that was built in 1965. It's not so fancy anymore. It was market rate. I'm going to bet that almost everyone on this Zoom lives in market rate housing because a private developer built it at some point. There may be a few people who live in subsidized housing. And in California, 90% of low-income people live in market rate housing. And probably 99.9% of middle-class people live in market rate housing. So even if we tripled the amount of subsidized affordable housing tomorrow, which would be an absolutely monumental undertaking, 70% of low-income Californians would still live in market rate housing. So we need to provide a lot of subsidies to create subsidized affordable housing. It's really important for low-income residents, but that will never solve even the low-income housing problem, let alone the middle-class problem. And only market rate housing, in addition to those subsidies, will solve the problem. And that's how we used to do it in California. We built market rate housing, a ton of it. And if you actually ramp up your production, it does stabilize and bring down prices. We don't want to collapse prices because collapsing the real estate market is probably not the healthiest thing for an economy, but you want to at least stop the explosion and start calming it down. And that's what this will do. With ADUs, you know, I think there are some ADUs that can be like deed restricted below market rate. Yeah. But I think in general, especially when you have like a homeowner who wants to put an ADU in, a rear yard cottage, or convert their garage or whatever, they just want to build it. And whether it's having a family member live in it or they want to rent it out to someone, and they probably don't want a permanent relationship with the government in terms of regulating the income of the people who live there. And so I think when we talk about subsidized below market rate housing, that really, to me, is more about multi-unit. You know, most cities' inclusionary ordinances go into effect of maybe around 10 units or 15, some are less than 10. And so to me, that's the focus of the deed restricted affordable housing. And, you know, ADUs we've already seen, since the state closed some of the loopholes in the last few years, the production of ADUs has really taken off throughout California. It's been extraordinary, a real success, and I think it's going to accelerate over time. And it won't solve the housing crisis, but that is like one of the pillars of solving the housing crisis.
Thank you. And so our final question is, how does rent control fit into this? Is it something that can help promote affordability? I support rent control. We've had it in San Francisco since 1979.
And like any system, no system is perfect, and every system has benefits and challenges. And rent control is no different. But when you have it's really, when you talk about rent control and the history of rent control, and I actually did not know this until maybe a few years back, that we had national rent control after World War II, and it didn't end in California until I think the early 50s, because we had a huge housing shortage. Housing costs were going through the roof. But then by the 1950s, and it was controversial when it ended in California, but by the 1950s, we were building so much housing that it really took a lot of the stress off the market. And then when did the rent control movement in California start again in a robust way? It was in the 1970s. Well, what happened in the 1970s? We started downzoning and making it much harder to build housing, and our housing production dramatically dropped, making housing more expensive, so more pressure on renters, and the movement for rent control started again. And in the late 70s, early 80s is when rent control ordinances were adopted. When you have, especially when you have a housing shortage, when housing is so expensive, low-income working-class renters, without that stability, it can be chaotic. And if we lost rent control in San Francisco, it would be just a disaster for the stability of our communities. So I did support the statewide rent cap and just cause bill. I think it was AB 1482 back in 2019. That it's not rent control, but it allows annual increases of 5% plus CPI, which is still pretty significant rent increase. But we were seeing like rent increases in non-rent controlled buildings of like 20, 30% a year. And that just creates instability.
Thank you so much, Senator Wiener. This was amazing.
Yeah, and someone posted in the chat, said, what about second homes? That's an interesting one. There is a real debate about should second homes have Prop 13 protection? Should second homes get the mortgage interest deduction? I think for existing owners of second homes, it's hard to take those away because people made those purchase decisions based on being able to deduct their mortgage interest based on certain property tax assumptions. But I think it's a fair question to start saying maybe in the future going forward, do we make changes there? And that's super controversial, beyond controversial, but I think those are conversations that we should have.
That's great. Thank you so much, Senator. We really appreciate this incredibly informative session you've given us. I mean, you've given us a lot to think about. There are so many options.